Okay, cool. I'm gonna share my screen and hopefully this looks okay. Okay, here it goes. So I call this presentation Take Note, Possibilities for Progress in the Realm of Classical Music. I think just because it's really important that there are options within activism for actual actionable change. So at the end of the presentation, I do offer like some suggestions for things that I think would be really helpful. Um, I wanted to begin with a land acknowledgement from Yale University. So Yale University acknowledges that Indigenous peoples and nations, including Mohegan, Mashantucket, Pequot, Eastern Pequot, Scotchetoak, Golden Hill Pagset, Neantic, and the Quinnipiac and other Algonquian-speaking peoples have stewarded through generations the lands and waterways of what is now the state of Connecticut. We honor and respect the enduring relationship that exists between these peoples and nations and this land. Okay, so quick intro about myself to start off. I did my undergrad at UCLA. I did dual degrees in music performance and music education. And I also was a student in the Asian American Studies department. I got my minor in Asian American Studies. And I'm currently first year master's student at Yale. So a lot of my interest in racial equity activism is from my upbringing. I grew up in an ethnoburb in California, which essentially means that I grew up in a predominantly non-white neighborhood. And so my personal transition to my undergraduate and graduate studies and kind of being removed from that ethnoburb really spurred me personally to pursue racial studies from an academic standpoint. Some of the work that I've done includes working on curating a newsletter for the Tubi phoneme community that's highlighting a lot of underrepresented musicians and composers. I've also worked with Asian American Diasporic Press, which is called Kaya Press, and we do a lot of Asian American publishing. And right now I'm getting my master's in tuba performance. And I think to my knowledge, I'm the first woman and also the first person of color to be graduating from my specific degree program. So yeah, that's a little bit about me. And so why do we need progress and how can we achieve it? I pulled this quote from Angela Davis. I'm no longer accepting the things I cannot change. I am changing the things I cannot accept. Because it's kind of a sentiment that I think is very important when discussing activism. Classical music is something that I obviously love very much. It's where I've done a lot of my work. A lot of my own research centers on it, but there are a lot of things that I've accepted for a long time in classical music that really, really do need to change. So hopefully this presentation can be a little baby step. I'm breaking this presentation into three distinct parts. So there's going to be primarily statistical data. There's going to be let me admit someone. There's going to be mostly quantitative data just to kind of showcase, I think, some facts that people aren't aware of. And then it'll accumulate into a more kind of discussion-based section. So it'll be musician makeup, conductor and music director makeup, and then finally repertoire. So to start off, this is a graph from a study conducted by the League of American Orchestras, and it's the percentage of white to non-white musicians in orchestras from 1980 to 2014. I know like a lot of people watching right now are all my friends who are musicians, so like people are aware that obviously contemporary orchestras are predominantly white, but I think this graph with the specific percentages really does help to break down that discourse of predominantly white institutions. So if you look in 1990, orchestras were only 3.4% non-white, and thankfully there has been a gradual increase all the way to 2014 on the right side of the graph. We're hovering at around 12% non-white currently, but even 12% is quite low. And again, this is just statistical objective data that was pulled from a study. This graph is kind of a breakdown of the specific racial and ethnic disparities and also trends within orchestras. Again, it's a little bit outdated by like 5 or so years, but if you look at the graph, it's pretty self-explanatory. So for obviously African American and Hispanic and Latino musicians, the increase in representation has been very, very minimal over the course of nearly 2 decades. For Asian American and Pacific Islander orchestral musicians, there is a much larger and visible increase, but still hovering at under 10% in the orchestra. So the two really important takeaways that I want to take away from that graph are, first of all, Black Americans make up 1.8% of American orchestral musicians and 13.4% of the US population. Hispanic and Latino musicians make up 2.5% of American orchestral musicians and 16.7% of the US population. So I think taking those statistics and breaking it down like this is very eye-opening. Even for someone who is a musician, reading this statement is always shocking to me because 2.5% and 1.8% are incredibly low. And so that kind of objective racial disparity is something that you really, really can't argue against. And it makes kind of the systemic inequality of the music industry very, very apparent. And so another point that I wanted to really highlight with the statistical data from the orchestra is that the racial wealth gap is a civil liberties issue. So unfortunately, trends in classical music really highlight historical inequalities because classical music and studying performance is very expensive. Being able to take private lessons, being able to study an instrument from a young age, being able to attend a conservatory, those are things that cost a lot of money and therefore are really only accessible for people who are of a certain socioeconomic standpoint, unless you have a very, very, rare opportunity to get into some kind of conservatory program that is free, which again, is an opportunity that's very lacking. And obviously the racial wealth gap is something that is an issue that requires constitutional reform, and it's something that goes beyond just music. However, it's very important, I think, for all of us to note the transparency and kind of parallel between the orchestra and also this matrix of domination that systemic inequality is reproduced in. I put a bullet point that says programs and schools need to address. So I think it's very, very important that one like baby step and also like really, really important step to changing this has to begin at like a very primary education level. So musical education begins when you're a kid and it has to be accessible when you're a kid. So again, this is kind of just a graph. This isn't pertaining to only music or only orchestra or only classical music. This is actually the median net worth of families in America. So if you look at the net worth, and by net worth, it means like including all of your stocks and assets, and most importantly, the largest asset, which is property. If you look at the trend of white to Black, Hispanic, and other, there is an incredible disparity between net worths of families. And again, this kind of ties into the point that although this is a larger issue of systemic inequalities and historical oppressions, contemporary orchestras act as kind of a reflection of those. And so it's really important to note that when you're consuming this kind of art or media, that these variables are still at play. And so I wanted to talk a little bit also about the model minority myth. Like if I really quickly go back to this slide, you can see that Asian Americans are the only ethnic and racial group in orchestras that have had some considerable amount of increase in representation over the past decade. And while that is awesome and amazing and it's some kind of progress, I do also want to address the fact that it contributes to model minority myth discourse. So this passage is from the study. Since 2002, the proportion of Asian and Pacific Islander orchestra musicians has increased by 70%, from 5.3% in 2002 to just over 9% in 2014. Comparatively, the growth and representation of other racial and ethnic groups has been much more modest. Specifically, the proportion of Hispanic and Latino musicians started at 1.8% in 2002 and grew to just 2.5% in 2014. Meanwhile, the proportion of African American musicians hovered at around 1.8% throughout the 12-year period. So this statement is kind of interesting to contend with because there is a diversification of the orchestra, but it's shown only in the Asian American racial ethnic group, or Asian also. And I wanted to talk a little bit about how that relates to the model minority myth. As an Asian American, given my positionality, this is something that I've done a lot of my personal research in. So I think it's also particularly relevant given the current political climate and rise of hate crimes against Asian Americans. So the model minority myth was coined in 1966 by William Peterson, and it labels Asian Americans as a hardworking and docile race group that has achieved financial and educational success in the United States. So stereotypes like Asians being good at math, the Asian prodigy musician who plays violin at the age of 3, Asians just getting straight A's, that kind of stereotype is all discourse that stems from the model minority myth. And I think what a lot of people don't know is that William Peterson, the guy who coined the term, was actually a white male sociologist. And coincidentally, well, this is not really a coincidence. He actually coined it because in 1966, what was happening in the American political climate was the civil rights movement. So essentially what happened was William Peterson was angry at the movement for racial justice that was being led by Black activists. He then decided to refer to specifically Japanese Americans at the time and call them the model minority myth and say that, these Japanese Americans aren't fighting for racial equity. They're being very docile. They're the great American minority. This is how everyone should be. And it was essentially not something that was meant to raise or empower Asian Americans. It was meant as a tool to disenfranchise Black Americans who were currently working in the civil rights movement. So debunking the myth, there's a couple of reasons why it's very problematic. The first being homogenization, right? So homogenization is a form of erasure. So because it forces a hegemonic discourse upon a widely diverse community. For example, by contending that all Asian Americans are this model minority myth, it is essentially ignoring anyone who doesn't fit into the mold. So refugees, incarcerated Asians, Asians who are of a lower socioeconomic status, undocumented Asians, all these groups in a very, very diverse population, and especially groups that need extra representation given historical context, are ignored because of the myth. It's also really important because cross-racial solidarity is very much needed. Given the political context of the American Civil Rights Movement, this myth has only served to create a cross-racial wedge between groups, particularly between Asians and Black Americans. It also invalidates struggles brought on by systemic racism by kind of offering that systemic racism is something that you can overcome just by putting your head down and working hard, which isn't true. And lastly, so immigration quota, this one is a lot more technical, but in the 1960s, during the Johnson era, America required a labor demand that was greater than what it could provide. And so that's kind of what motivated a really large trend in immigration. And that's a lot of the reason why many Asians are in the US today. And it's why a lot of musicians actually are able to come, like second and third generation Asian musicians. So immigration legislation regimes control the allowed demographics. Specifically, the 1965 Hart-Celler Act only allowed for people who were able to contribute to the economy to enter into the country. So if you think about that, if the country is only allowing socioeconomically advantaged people to immigrate legally, that means that the majority of the representation is going to be of a socioeconomically advantaged group, which is also the group of people that would obviously be able to allow their children to pursue musical studies because of the economic implications of getting a classical musical training. So hopefully this kind of makes sense. And again, while it is important that Asian representation has increased in orchestras in recent years, it's also very important to separate it from this model minority myth and brush it off as, oh, Asians are doing better, so there's more of them in the orchestra, because that's not true, right? Like, so all the slides I talked about before with the model minority myth is kind of reason as to why we need to focus on the lower rates of Black and Latino musicians who are able to get jobs in orchestras today. And it's kind of this wrap up on my topic. It's called a myth for a reason. Current orchestral makeup should not contribute to model minority myth discourse, right? So this does nothing to help historically underrepresented groups. It doesn't help Asian Americans because, like I mentioned earlier, it homogenizes the group and it creates a racial wedge. And also it's a diversity token, right? So looking at a group of people and advertising them as progress when really there are a lot of really deeply seated issues is very, very problematic, and something that very much happens in orchestras. If you look at poster boards, if you look at advertisements in metropolitan areas with opera companies and orchestras, chances are the people on those posters are probably people of color, oftentimes Asian, and kind of advertising this idea or ideal that the orchestra is now a diverse place, when in reality, oftentimes these musicians are being used as tokens, and there are still very much problems that exist. So yeah, that's kind of the musician section of the presentation. I'm moving on to the conductor and music directors. This section of the presentation is a little shorter just because there's really only one music director or conductor for an opera company or orchestra. So there's a smaller data sample, but still you can see the trend. This particular study is from 2006 to 2016. So over the course of a decade, the darker blue is, I mean, you can probably guess, the darker blue is non-white conductors, and the kind of teal color is white conductors. So then this is pretty recent, just 5 years ago, only 21% of conductors and music directors were non-white in American orchestras, which again, while not as severe as musician, disparity is still a very stark contrast. There is also a pretty noticeable trend in the racial and ethnic profile of top executives in orchestras, so people who are executive directors, CEOs, or presidents. So a lot of these people who are making really big financial decisions are also overwhelmingly white. In fact, the non-white makeup of top executives since 2002 has hovered between 1.6 and 5.2%. So again, very, very low representation for any non-white top executives of the music industry, specifically of the classical music industry. Cool. So again, that part was a little bit shorter just because there are less people to participate in the study because there's one per orchestra. But we're going to move on to repertoire and programming, which is a very contentious point right now in classical music. So this data is pulled from the Institute of Composer Diversity. And this is from the 2019 orchestra season. So like technically the most recent orchestra season that happened because of COVID. And they pulled every single work that was performed and programmed in the whole year. And this is the percentage of works by underrepresented composers. So 8% of all music in 2019 in the entire season across the entire United States was by women composers, which means that 92% of music programmed was by men. Composers from underrepresented racial, ethnic, and cultural heritage is at 6%. So 94% of programmed works from 2019 were from white composers. And so underrepresented composers as a whole was 11%. And again, just to kind of give you the scope and magnitude of this study, this is from every single program piece. So there's thousands and thousands and thousands of pieces of music that were programmed. And so even though 309 pieces, like for women composers, is a large number, it still really only makes up 8% of the total total repertoire that was programmed. In very great contrast to those statistics, this study is the number of orchestras that performed works by a composer at least 3 times. So for example, there were 56 orchestras in 2019 that played Beethoven at least 3 times. So 46%, nearly half of all American orchestras played Beethoven at least 3 times. And 23% of orchestras played Mozart at least 3 times, 10% played Brahms at least 3 times, and 10% played Tchaikovsky at least 3 times. And so to put this into context again, these are individual composers. So Beethoven was played more than basically like all women composers for all of 2019. So there's a very, very large disparity in how classical musicians are choosing to program music today. I also just wanted to show really quickly, so this is a really great resource called the Composer Diversity Project, and I'm just gonna open it up. And you can go in and look for works diversity. I hope you guys can see this. So like, for example, let's see how many works there are by people of color. So I'm going to check all of them. And I actually haven't done this before, but that's part of the that's part of the point, right? So I'm going to scroll down and cool. So there's 145 pages of music that was composed by people of color just on this website alone. And this page, I mean, this page probably has like 15 or so. So 15 times 145. There's a lot of music out there by people of color. So the lack of programming is not from a lack of material, right? Like what I just proved, it takes, you can click on a link, click on a couple boxes, and there's a lot of music out there. And that kind of drives home the point that this kind of systemic inequality is coming from the institution, right? It's not coming from a place of, oh, we just don't have music by diverse composers. That's very much not true, as I just showed you. It's just people are choosing not to program diverse repertoire. And so in addition to lacking really diverse programming in classical music currently, there's also a lot of really problematic programming. So the music that is played really negatively contributes to discourse. There's a lot of music out there that is appropriated and has problematic narratives. And I have like 2 examples that I can play. I think they're both really well known and famous and in movies. Like, for example, Ride of the Valkyries. I hope you guys can hear that. So that's a piece that obviously is very famous in the classical repertoire, but has also made its way into the film and TV industry. Movies like off the top of my head, I know that Crazy Rich Asians plays this excerpt in the movie, but I don't know if non-musicians are aware that Wagner, who composed this, expressed very explicitly in his personal writings very anti-Semitic views. And so we're still programming composers that have these very, very problematic views. And part of the problem, I think, is that there needs to be an awareness about it. I don't think necessarily that we need to cancel the music, because a lot of it is really great music. And we need to be able to separate the art from the artist. But there's a lack of an awareness around it is part of the issue. Another example is this aria from Turandot. Again, I think that these two are just recognizable by ear, regardless of your training as a musician. They're pieces that people know and that have made their way into popular media. But like for example, this opera, the aria that I just played, Puccini wrote it, and he's also notoriously problematic. All of his narratives and his storylines and plot lines are very Orientalist, often depicting Eastern quote unquote cultures as foreign and exotic and savage. And so these works are still very frequently programmed and listened to and reproduced. And I think that part of the problem lies with classical musicians being aware of the issue and still doing it. That's one side of it. And the other side of the problem is that for non-musicians who are consuming the music, there's a lack of awareness because classical musicians choose not to kind of uh, advertise the problematic nature of these really, really standard pieces in the repertoire. So there are, oops, sorry, I don't want that to play. There are a couple options that I'm writing out that I think are going to be very helpful and that are already happening in most orchestras. I think there's a lot of progress being made, but I think it's helpful to kind of just reiterate them. But for musicians, informed programming is really important. So informed programming involves a lot of things from your own personal research on the composer and the music to also the audiences that are going to be listening to it. When you put on a recital, trying to make sure that you're performing a diverse collection of music. Another thing that is helpful is to support organizations. So there are a lot of organizations out there, like I mentioned before, that help support primary education music. So that's kind of where it really begins, that socioeconomic divide with the racial wealth gap. Being able to raise awareness and support these organizations is very important. And for listeners and audiences who maybe, even if you're not a musician, these things are helpful, but being able to contact groups like orchestras, chamber groups, universities to express interest in music that is racially equitable is very important. Even here at Yale, I think that if a non-School of Music student emailed and reached out to our orchestra director or manager and said, hey, I'm a student, I would love to hear this type of music being played by Yale, that kind of thing makes a difference because music is kind of something that is supposed to be performed for an audience, right? So if the audience makes a request, makes a demand, that's something that can create a lot of change. And also, like, as listeners, we can all support and share music of historically marginalized musicians, teachers, and composers. For conservatories and schools, including Yale, where we have a really great school of music, being able to create accessible curriculum is very important. A lot of the curriculum is certainly outdated. The academic landscape, while this is not only true for music, it is very, very severe in music, but the academic landscape of curriculum and classes that are offered and materials that are studied are very outdated. There are things that need to be included that are not included in traditional conservatory educations. And a lot of that can be helped, maybe not solved, but helped by implementing training for music educators, kind of broadening the scope of education for music students. And then, of course, for orchestras and opera companies, classical musicians, classical groups like chamber orchestras, as institutions, being able to create opportunities for historically underrepresented musicians and composers is also really, really key. Many orchestras, particularly larger budget orchestras, are already doing this, which is amazing. But outreach programs and fellowships would specifically cater to musicians of color, specifically for Black and Latinx musicians who have historically been lacking in opportunity, is very, very important to being able to create a racially equitable realm of classical music. And with that, I'm gonna wrap up. I'm sorry if I talk too fast, but that's the presentation. And yeah, oh yeah, these are my sources. I don't know if people are interested, but I know this is being recorded, so I'll just pause here for a second in case people want to look up any of the sources that I used. Especially this one, racial, ethnic, and gender diversity study in the orchestra field, is really a minefield of information. I didn't include much research on gender diversity study just because there was so much to cover in the racial and ethnic study section. But again, this study is really, really great and contains a lot of important information. So yeah, I think I'll stop sharing my screen now. That's basically it. I know it was really fast and it kind of like glossed over a lot of big and small things, but it's kind of meant to be like an introductory like statistical breakdown of why orchestras need to change. So yeah.
Wow, that was amazing. Thank you so much for teaching us all that. And I know I have a couple of questions, but I think it'd be great if we opened it up and saw if anyone else has questions. And I can give you guys a minute to think of them. And then, yeah.
Yeah, I feel like here, maybe I'm just gonna put this like PDF in the chat of the study that I was pulling the graphs from, because it is very shocking to me, even as someone who plays in orchestras, to see the actual number breakdown of like just how many women there are, how many Black musicians there are. Like it's very, very, very shocking. Even as someone who's like experienced being on stage in that kind of situation. So yeah, you guys should look at that study. It's very good. It's a couple of years outdated, but
thank you for sharing that.
good stuff. Yeah.
Hi, Vivi. So I kind of had a thought. I don't know if it's a question, maybe it's just like a continuing line of questioning, because I've thought about this topic quite a bit before. And there was something a teacher said to me once that, at least in their experience, they saw more women. This was specifically about women, but they saw more women studying music like in high school and stuff like that. But once you hit college, it seemed like a lot of the ratios flipped. And so I don't know if that, I haven't looked into whether that applies to racial and ethnic minorities as well, but it was just something that while I was listening to your presentation, I was like, I wonder if that also has something to do with it, because you are seeing more programs now for like underrepresented youth. Like I know I work for an org specifically targeted towards low income Black and Latinx students in LA. And I don't know. I just wonder if something about that college divide also has something to do with the lack of representation in orchestra. So it's not like a question you can answer now, but just something.
No, I think that's valid. Like that's totally true. There's definitely, and definitely from my own experience too, there's more girls like in orchestra, in band in high school than there are in college for sure. And I think part of that is because like it's like a reproductive cycle. Like the orchestra doesn't have as many women, and so when girls look at the orchestra, they might not see a career there because there just aren't many people. And like while there are many trailblazers in the field, especially for instruments that are typically more masculine, so like larger and lower sounding instruments, it's like if there's no one there before you, it can be hard to like want to pursue a career in that field. So I think you're totally right. Like I think the divide in college is also like a big thing, because choosing to study music means that you want to pursue classical music, and that's like you're only going to want to pursue it if like you really love it, and usually if you know that you can do it. And sometimes for some people in particular demographics, like you don't know if you can do it because people before you haven't done it before. But yeah.
I definitely like that. I think I agree with that idea. The representation growing up, I didn't think it was that important, and then by now I'm like, no, it really did influence me. Because
Yeah.
I never saw female conductors growing up, really. And when I was a kid, I thought maybe I should be a conductor, but then I literally had no idea where to begin. How do you take conducting lessons? What even is that? And so I just didn't pursue it. And so like I don't know. I definitely think representation, you're right, has a lot to do with it.
Yeah, it's like it's hard to make it accessible when you can't like see what's there, like what can happen. But yeah. Thanks for coming also.
Thanks for sending the link. I couldn't find it.
I'm curious about some of the initiatives to have young kids involved in music. And I'm wondering, I remember, like I grew up in California as well. I don't know if you went to UCLA and are also from California or you grew up there too. Oh yeah, you said you did. Anyway, okay.
Yeah, I'm from California.
Okay, sweet. And I remember like going through so many budget cuts like in high school, and schools just like slashing music programs. And I'm wondering how like that ties into all of this. And also, yeah, like if then outside orgs are kind of like supplemental, or if they kind of sometimes replace these like school music programs, and just your thoughts on that.
Yeah, that's really interesting, actually. I think the best kind of way to think about it is that like the arts and music in particular are like an indicator species in education. So like you're from like the School of Environment, right? So like you totally get that. Like there are indicator species. You can tell how a certain environment is doing off of our particular, whatever it is. And so music is one of those things. Like if you look at a school program and you look at their music department, if the music department is well funded, chances are the parents there are probably paying really high property taxes. Chances are the students are probably majority white. If you look at a school that has slashed its music programs, that has, lacking instruments in the department, lacking teachers, it's probably a red line community or a community where parents are working full time and living in houses that they don't own. Those things are very much tied because the first thing to go usually is going to be the arts, and usually music goes first. And so again, like a lot of these orgs that are serving kind of underrepresented kids in groups that are of a lower socioeconomic class, a lot of times they don't have music programs at their own schools, and that's why those orgs have to exist. So like there's a lot in Los Angeles where I did my undergrad where there's just a lot of kids who don't have access to instruments because their school can't afford it, right? Like if you go to a private school where parents are able to pay a lot of money, able to write out those checks, the kids aren't going to be able to get a music education because they're going to be able to physically buy instruments in the first place. Whereas in a lot of inner city schools where, you have to worry about whether or not you can get lunch that day, getting an actual instrument into your hand is not going to be the first priority. And so that's where a lot of those organizations come in. Like they're able to offer monetary support to get teachers to come, to get guest artists to come, to put on concerts, like make programs, that kind of thing. So that's kind of where it's important. And you do have to start really young to pursue like a career in classical music. Most people start like middle school at the very latest. So it's very important to have those like organizations catering to primary and middle schools for sure.
Thank you. Do other people have questions? Okay, well, I'm gonna stop the recording here and just